All right, good evening, everyone. I'd like to call this regular Board of Finance meeting for July 21st to order. If you could all please join us in the pledge.
Here.
Dean Gorman. Here. Virginia San Pietro.
Here.
Ted Dumaine.
Here.
Gary Stallworth is absent. Matt Radin. Present. Keith Shield.
Here.
Matt, in Gary's absence, you have the opportunity for voting rights.
I'll accept.
Okay, very good. All right, acceptance of the minutes from the June 16th, 2021 meeting. Minutes were distributed. Any questions or comments on the minutes?
Move to accept.
Okay, motion to accept. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, second. Any other discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. All right, our first item under new business is to discuss and act on Board of Education 2% savings policy. So we had back at our May Board of Finance meeting made the decision to table this discussion. For those who remember back to the May meeting, we had discussed a potential policy that the Board of Finance would be maybe looking to adopt, but we needed to give more time, particularly for the Board of Education, to review it. And they came through with some recommendations. And then another thing that was discussed was that we still had a couple questions from a legality standpoint. And so one of the things we did is we waited to hear back with a legal opinion from our town attorney, which Kevin had reached out to for us. And then also we got a legal opinion from the Board of Education, initially from Ken, and then also got an some updated information from our new superintendent, Paul, who's here with us tonight. So we have since received all those items back as far as the feedback on the original policy draft and the legal opinions. So the plan tonight is to, with all this in mind, have some further discussion on it and decide what is our next move when it pertains to this 2% savings policy. So Board of Finance members will certainly have the opportunity to discuss and ask questions, but at this time I would like to recognize our Board of Education Chair, Christy Haskell, with anything that she would like to state to the board.
All right. Well, thank you for having us back and agreeing to meet what we investigated and communicated with between the Board of Finance and brought on our new superintendent. I'm going to defer to Mr. Paul Breton to speak since it will be his first time with the Board of Finance to introduce the opinions that we have from our legal and to answer any further questions. He has extensive experience with 2% set-asides as well, since he had that experience with his former district, Illinois and Story West. Mr. Breton.
I don't know what's protocol. Is the protocol to stand or just to normally sit?
You can say it.
So I spent 15 years in the classroom, so I work better standing. One of the things that I put together for the Board of Finance at the request of the board chair was further explanation on MBR. I wasn't sure if all the members of the Board of Finance had a chance to receive that or had a chance to print it for today's meeting. So I have some additional copies here for members of the Board of Finance who might be interested, just so you can see what I sent forward. I also will have some available for the public if there are individuals who are interested in the public as well. But what I'd like to speak to from that is really to speak to answer any questions that you have about MBR and how it impacts, and then also talk a little bit about how the 2% set aside could be utilized by the district. As part of our work in preparing for the meeting, we did survey all the districts regionally to determine who's utilizing the 2% set aside and how they're utilizing it, because we thought it might guide our conversation and we thought it might be germane to the work that we're doing. We did discuss some districts having full policies, as you're talking about. There are also some districts that simply have verbal agreements. And because the Board of Finance has the power to annually determine whether or not funds are distributed into the 2% set aside, some towns have determined that they don't need a full policy because any violation of the verbal agreement would cause them to no longer continue to make those deposits. And that information is on the very final page of what we have there and what we shared with the group. What I'd like to start with, I didn't know if there was extras on the end or how many I passed along, so thank you so much. I thought I'd share those with the public. I saw people behind me reaching for them. So what I'd like to just start by speaking to is some of the advantages and what the advantages the 2% set aside provides the town of Plainfield. First and foremost is a protection from MBR, which is the minimum budget requirement from unanticipated expenses. As you know, the MBR is computed based on a variety of factors. The largest is our previous year's appropriation, and then I'm happy to go into that formula a little bit further. If for some reason we have an overrun and we need to go back to the town to ask for an appropriation, that increases the MBR. This could happen in a variety of ways. If we take a look at the capital improvement plan for the district, the capital improvement plan, which I also have copies of if anyone would like to see, lists the heater repair at PCMS over the next 2 years to be anticipated fully around $1.5 million based on the initial expenses that were quoted for it when we generated that quote. If that system goes down, the small estimated cost was around $50,000. As you know, $50,000 would be something we would have to come to the town for appropriations on, and that would increase our MBR. Additionally, the fund serves as an excellent place to hold funds for special education cost overruns, should we have them. Now, we did some initial research preparing for this meeting, anticipating the question of what was the highest cost individual student that we had had in the last 5 years was. The highest individual tuition cost we've had, Mr. Sugarman, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was approximately $300,000.
Correct.
For one individual student who moved into district, and it cost us $300,000. Right now, I think our highest individual student cost is around $160,000. You'll note that I noted here that in 2020, Greenwich, which is not Plainfield, obviously, had a series of individuals move into their town, which caused individually 2 families $1.2 million increase in their special ed budget. It caused them to freeze their entire budget. So having the 2% set aside protects us from those other things. The other piece that it gives us the ability to invest in capital improvement projects. When we take a look at how capital improvement projects are done, the timeline for an invitation to bid or an RFP is often something that we want to time very specifically. I'll use, for example, that in our capital improvement project, we're looking to address parking lots in several sites, Moosa being one that I'm thinking of specifically. Those of you who work in that industry know that there's times when petroleum gets particularly high, and that might not be the best time to go out for bids on lots. But having that money in the 2% set aside but designated for capital improvements allows us to run an RFP process in such a way that the town can get the best value out of the funds. The third piece that I really want to touch on, which is why I have Rena here because she's done so much for the district and I did ask her to come, is this gives us the ability to apply for matching grants. So if you think back to the history of how much we've gotten in Plainfield from grants, everything from our gymnasiums to band uniforms from the Begary Trust, we annually apply for 2 matching grants that we're required to match funds for. One is the primary mental health care grant. That provides services for young children to become accustomed to school. A second one of the matching grants is the McKinney-Vento grant. That's a homeless grant, which provides money for transportation, tutoring for homeless students. If those grants are awarded, we're required to match funds. Oftentimes, those funds are in kind, but those funds are also things that we don't necessarily always budget for. The largest one that I want to highlight here, though, is the school security grant. The school security grant, which we have the opportunity to apply for annually when the state issues it, and I say annually because, as we all know, there are times when the state chooses not to issue grants, is a grant that allows us to improve our entrances, security cameras, create security all over the building. These are the buzz-in doors. That's a full matching funds grant. So we have the opportunity to apply for those funds, but we must match that dollar for dollar. We don't have the opportunity to use in-kind services for that grant. The fourth piece I want to speak to is that it gives us the advantage managed to take opportunities for possible efficiencies. One of the great examples, I think, is something that's on this agenda tonight, which is the Infinite Vision software, which is an example of a bulk municipal purchase done by many different towns in eastern Connecticut. By getting on board that bulk municipal purchase and timing it at that time, we were able to get some cost savings on training, and we were able to get some cost savings as a group in a group purchase. And the last piece I want to talk to is, as we all know, there are going to be times when we have non-budgetal occasional expenses. And the best example I can give of this is when we think about, we're standing in an auditorium right now that Dr. Biggood and I were talking about earlier as hosted. We don't know how many junior proms and weddings and other events in town. We have similar auditoriums throughout the school district that have curtains. Those curtains are fire retardant curtains. That fire retardant system for those curtains expires about every 25 years. To purchase of one of those curtains is about $50,000 and not going down. They're not making them any cheaper year by year. Those are the sort of things that are part of our capital improvement plan, but they're also things that we don't want to come back to the town for, where if we're unable to fund the capital improvement plan, saying we're exposing ourselves because we have a curtain that's not up to code. So having the ability to do these one-time expenses. Another great example that I can put here is band uniforms. I'm amazed of things that I think I'm in the wrong business sometime when I learned that one full wool band uniform is approximately $400. So if you're purchasing 100 band uniforms so that you have them for everyone, and we did have matching funds from Gary Trust. We have marvelous band uniforms, a marvelous program. But if that expense came up, we would not want to come to the town to appropriate $40,000 for band uniforms. And as you know, that's not a sum that we want to have sitting in a fundraising account. That's not something that we would like to be working on, to have an account to be building $40,000 over several years of bake sales. So these are certainly opportunities the 2% set aside provides us. If you look at the final page of districts that we surveyed, and I want to explain how we got this information, just so that you know. We sent out a survey to all the regional superintendents and business managers. The survey asked them, do they have a 2% set aside, and then what additional elements were there for the fund agreements? And then we also asked, is there anyone who's in the process of developing them? So there are five towns listed below: Andover, Brooklyn, Voluntown, Canterbury, Union. Those are towns who currently do not utilize the 2% set aside, but I have spoken with some superintendents in those towns. They are in conversations about this, especially now during COVID. And with that, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you.
Questions, comments from the board members?
I just want to verify, you didn't already have this account, right?
Mhm.
I was
I believe we motioned it into existence a year ago. It was either at a July meeting or a June, well, must have been a July meeting after the end of their fiscal year.
I thought I heard you say you would not want to ask the town, for instance, for $50,000. Did I hear you correctly?
You did. So to expand on that, by having the money in the non-lapsing fund, if the non-lapsing fund didn't exist and we had to come to the town for $50,000 for, say, a stage curb, or the parking lots are about $50,000 in the capital improvement plan. They haven't obviously gone out to bid, but it's approximately that cost. If the town appropriates those funds for us, that then becomes part of the minimum budget requirement. So the following year, when the state gives us our MBR computation, that $50,000 is added to whatever our budget was. That actually becomes part of our budget for that year. So one of the things that the 2% set aside does is it protects the town and the taxpayers from having an increase. There are towns regionally which appropriated money for COVID expenses.
Does it make any difference where that money comes from? For instance, out of the fund balance?
If it comes from the general fund balance, that's an appropriation.
objections do you have for the people of the town to vote on something like this? When you got this money to go into that 2% account, it's because somewhere you overfunded some line item, am I right?
I'm not sure I understand.
How do you get money to go into this 2% fund set aside?
I would look at, so I wasn't here in previous years to maintain the budget, so I can't speak to what decisions were made that caused for money to be in surplus in previous years.
Mr. Brett, may I go ask that? Like,
Yeah, please.
when we built the budget prior to our COVID pandemic, we built it with all the knowledge of what was going to be needed to run the schools. Once COVID came in and we started doing things like restricting access to the schools for the children, we didn't need the transportation. So the transportation subcontractor allowed us to pay them less dollars for that school year. So it wasn't a missed budgeting. It was we didn't need their services, and therefore we underran the budget. That was the biggest piece, the transportation piece. There are other components that, because the children weren't in school, we didn't have to spend the money, and as a result, we underran our budgets. So that's where the money is coming from.
I didn't mean to imply that you didn't make out a proper budget.
Oh, no, I didn't take it that way.
Your ability at the time you make out the budget, it is 100% correct in your mind.
Oh, absolutely.
It does not always turn out that way. We know that.
Well,
You're
no.
going to have excesses, you're going to have line item transfers. God, even as great as our town is run, where is it? We have line item transfers. And that's a much smaller budget. That's common.
Yes,
So that's not a misappropriation or whatever you call it. Please don't.
I did not interpret it that way.
But anyway, you get that because you have excess funds. And so you use them. You made all your line item transfers, and now you still have money. This is money that's been appropriated by the town for specific uses, but it's no longer going to be used for them specific uses. So why would you deny them the right to vote on the specific purpose you want to use it for now? Why don't you want to go to the town? Come out of the fund balance. Forgetting the MBR.
Well, I don't think we can forget the MBR. See, that's part of the issue. The issue is if we need to ask the town for specific monies over $50,000, it adds to the appropriation. And that's what's driving the MBR. Where if the money that was unspent from the prior year is allowed to be put into the 2% set aside, we can use those funds and access those funds without impacting the MBR. We happen to be in a two-year cycle where we have excess dollars because of services that we didn't need or didn't use. And the chances are very slim that we'd be in a situation like this again.
Well, right now is your request for 50 or less.
You don't have a
No,
request specifically for any money at this point.
Actually, excuse me if I may, are you alluding to the next line on the agenda?
Yeah.
That was a purchase for the Infinite Visions that we budgeted as use from the 2% set aside so that it didn't impact the MBR.
So that's already in the set aside.
Yes.
Well, one thing that I've become a little more educated on is the overall MBR calculation. And I do feel like, in all fairness, it does need to be acknowledged that the appropriation is but one part of that overall formula. And there are numerous other elements of this formula that take that number up or down to this point. Am I correct?
You're absolutely correct. In fact, the first 2 pages of the memo that I provided go through those other elements. Would you like me to speak to them? So when we talk to the other elements, and there's a few that don't apply to us, but let me speak to what does. So it starts with the appropriation. The first possible deduction is what's called the designated high school deduction. And if you want to understand what that is, that's for towns that don't have their own high school. We have a marvelous high school, so that does not apply to us. There is no deduction in our MBR based on that. The second one is what's called a possible efficiency cap. What's an efficiency cap? An efficiency cap was designed for large districts that come up with new efficiencies in their systems. So let's say that you are a large district that employs a human resource staff of 80 people, and you purchase a piece of software that allows you to make that 2 people. You have the ability to reduce your MBR if you eliminate 78 of those people and apply to the Commissioner of Ed for an efficiency cap. The only individual who has the ability to approve an efficiency cap is the Commissioner of Ed. So it has to be approved. It's not something the town can decide, we're subtracting this money from the MBR. There's actually a process that goes to the Commissioner of Education, which I believe is outlined as part of the statute. Second piece is the enrollment increase or decrease. This is a trend which, if you have the forms, I believe over there, the State Department of Ed computes those for us. I would note, as I put here, that we anticipate that due to COVID, what we're hearing from the State Department of Ed is that they're going to have a hold harmless on next year's MBR for the increase or decrease in enrollment, because enrollment numbers across the state were very unpredictable during COVID. As you know, a lot of families chose to have their children go remote. Some chose to go homeschooled. Some chose to relocate to places where there was different rules related to education that they felt better met their family's needs. Alliance status, which may increase or decrease. You'll notice for us, we are not an alliance district. If we were an alliance district, as Putnam, Thompson, and Killingly, all of our neighbors to the north are, that actually would hold the MBR fixed. We are not, so we've actually received reductions in previous MBRs if you look based on that alliance.
If I may just pause you for 1 second, just for clarity. I noticed when researching that alliance district designation, it seems to be a number that isn't exactly fixed, even if you're not an alliance district. So is that a scale of where you rank on the list above like the bottom 33? Does that fluctuate with a placement? And what's the formula that is placing those schools on there?
So I'll give you 2 answers to that. There's not a formula that's placed the schools as alliance districts. The state went through and labeled alliance districts, and the state representative can probably better speak to the process of who's on that. The alliance district list, to my knowledge, has not changed in several years since they fixed the funding for alliance. There's a fixed set of funding, and because of that reason, they haven't revisited that list. The last time that I'm aware that the list was revisited was approximately 5 years ago, but that's an estimate. There are some districts on that list. I'll give Vernon as an example. That's a fairly high-performing district, relatively given their affluence, which looks very different than, say, Putnam. But Vernon qualified for Alliance and actually receives per pupil more Alliance funds than Putnam does. The explanation of that funding you have to get from the State Department of Ed and the Commissioner's Office. Many superintendents have asked that question. I think it's a great question. The computation of whether or not there's an alliance increase or decrease is also based on computations of the State Department of Ed.
Thank you. I think I remember Ken telling us at one point that we had looked into becoming one, and we did not.
Our students rose in their scores and their testing. We were at risk, and our students performed very well. So we were able to remove ourselves from the state watch list, which we are very proud of. And our principals have done an excellent job at that. I do not see us becoming an alliance district.
And the final 2 are closed school reductions if you close a school, because obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, because you would not be having the expenses of running another school, you have the ability to reduce MBR if you were to close a school. The final piece of this, the catastrophic event deduction, is a deduction that would come if there is a nationally designated catastrophic event, and the state would notify you of that impacting your pieces. Small items do not impact that, so we, I don't believe, qualified for a catastrophic event destruction when we had our fire a few years ago.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chair and Ted, I guess I would aim this comment at you. My understanding to this is absent a 2% account being present in the town, the school would have to request additional funds from the fund balance, the process we have established. And while that could potentially increase the MBR because it would be additional appropriation, correct me if I'm wrong, it is by no means going to be you appropriate an additional 50,000 and your MBR is going to go up by 50,000. There are a number of other elements that will impact what your final MBR placement is at. It's not a one-to-one ratio that we can point to here.
It's not a one-to-one, but it's very close, because those additional elements don't vary year to year. If you were to look at our MBR over the last few years, you'll see that those additional elements and deductions don't have a lot of variance.
I see 2 points on here, though, that might indicate that it could have a greater variance. One being the enrollment figure, for a number of reasons nowadays, but also the efficiency cap and what might be cascaded down underneath that, savings realized through efficiencies. As far back as I can find in reports that are published on the state website, which is only 2 forms, so not a huge volume to go off of here. But in my brief time on the board, complementary to this, I don't remember there being anything brought to us or that's been reflected in MBR calculations on submitted efficiencies. Is it a really short list of what you can request, or is there just is it a non-starter in terms of trying to look for what might fit into that category?
I think it's very few and far between that the Commissioner of Education appoints that, and that's because it has to be very large-scale efficiencies.
I understand that. My question was emanating from the Board of Ed. Have we identified, gone through, and presented and had those discussions?
We have
For
nothing
submission.
significant of that size to even consider. I mean, our human resources is only 2 to 3 people. I wouldn't consider that we would have anything that would even remotely qualify us for that.
Is it limited to a staffing reduction? Are there other elements? I mean, in the grand scheme of things, we're talking about the total of 2% of what your previous year budgeted or the adopted year budget was. And that, for us, not that it's a small dollar amount, but at around $700,000, $720,000, that's still only, as defined, 2% of what we have here. So even small, identifiable possible savings, even for the submission of work, could still reduce the need to be going either to the taxpayers or to be decreasing that MBR number if there was to be an appropriation made in the middle of the year, feeding into the possible it's not a one-to-one entry on your increase in the school budget at that point. My overall point just being that when we're discussing this, I feel that it's maybe a little more precise to say that an appropriation is not necessarily that guarantee that we're increasing the budget by that exact dollar amount either. But there's other factors at play here.
It's a possibility.
I think that's a fair statement.
One question on directors, Christy and Butler, Ron. How did we in the past, before the days of COVID, and before we had this 2% policy, how did we get by in the past where this was always still a possibility, back then, of course, of having to come to the town and having an expense like that, and of course affecting the MBR? How did we get through so many years prior to that?
Well, to give you the example of the band uniforms, when that came up and we were with the matching grant, we spoke with, I believe it was Mr. C at the time, and we were told that there was only a maximum of $10,000 that we could ask for. So we came and we asked for that because he felt that at that point, if we had gone to referendum for a larger amount, it would not have passed. So we are always very careful with that. In the past, we've also had to come to ask for special education, and that would have we've had to go to referendum with that as well.
Isn't that part of the process of dealing with tax dollars, though?
It
Making
is.
sure we have the consent and approval of those who are paying the taxes?
It is, but there's also, we cannot always control if a student comes in out of district, or with those capital expenses, it would be nice to be able to have that 2% set aside to be able to act in a more efficient way.
In other words, when we have to appropriate more money, when we had to appropriate more money for special ed, because we got more students and they needed it, that money increased our MBR.
examples you mentioned they're not without merit for the use of funds out of such an account. But I do have to feel that this is all part and parcel of what is an annual rigorous budget process. And the fact that we can list these events and these situations and these grants and these possibilities and scenarios means that we clearly have a very apt and forward-looking administration that is aware of what can happen. And I was under the impression, and still am, that these are baked into that budget process. And that's something that we go with annually every year to present what the district is going to need. And part of the needs of the financial needs of the school district are going to be to cover those risks that you can't quite put your finger on.
Well,
that we
let me
feel are
speak
appropriate.
to heating, for example. I've been on the board for 11 years now. And all 11 years, I've always come and we've spoken on the need for heating. We have a school that if something was to go wrong, we would have to come and we would have to ask for them. Our heating systems are outdated. That's been on capital improvement for a number of years. However, that's always one of those things, we do what we can, we put the Band-Aid on, we do the best we can. But with the money that we put into the 2% set aside, it is a very real possibility that we would be able to knock out possibly even one of those schools, reducing the need to go to a bond.
Correct me if I'm wrong, and I'll field the question, Madam Chair, ask previous year's closing prior to COVID, what has been the average delta of the year-end surplus?
$3,000 to $10,000.
That seems like a very, very small number, which is good
I don't
for
sleep
budgeting
during June.
practices.
I don't sleep during June.
I assumed as much, and I have a lot of respect for all finance directors as they try to steer that ship. This seems to be something that specifically with COVID has created a very large outlier event in terms of the underlines, to put it as objectively as I can. And once, as we get further past this COVID event, I don't see a situation where we still have hundreds of thousands of dollars as underrun in the school budget. This seems like a one-time type of occurrence that we are arguing as a long-term tool in the toolbox. And I don't see the need to try to set a rule based on an outlier in this case.
I'm happy to speak to that. I think that's a great
More as a general comment, yeah, not directing it towards.
but I'm happy to speak to this. I think it's a great point. With proper fiscal management, we don't anticipate being here, which I think the process accounts for that. The process allows the district to one time a year annually approach the Board of Finance and say, this is where we are, and the Board of Finance has the choice to say we're going to put it in this non-lapsing account up to 2%, or we're going to return it to the general fund. And the use of that fund then becomes based on whatever the mutual agreement of how it's designated for. So if it's designated for these improvements and these pieces, then we have that opportunity. As of right now, we have approximately, Mr. Lucier, about a little over 500,000 in the fund.
The current 2% set aside is just over 500,000.
Just over 500,000. So if we were to do the max appropriation and put in over 700,000, we would be looking at about 1.3, or 1.2. I apologize. That 1.2 would be there for cost overruns or for those projects as the Board of Education identifies them. It provides us with some insurance should something happen. It also gives us an opportunity to tackle some much needed capital improvement projects that are part of the capital improvement plan, which haven't been addressed. And there is opportunity to address some things with COVID funds. That question was asked to me by someone in email. However, there are many things that are not. I can't resurface a parking lot with COVID funds. It would be a far stretch to apply social distancing to the parking lot resurfacing.
The additional, if the money is in the 2%, I agree, you can spend it on that, but doesn't that eliminate the town, the people's voice, is whether
that there's ways to structure it to where if it was to be used, it is the board's intent that we would use it.
For something that was on.
Correct. More on lines of with what you see on that last page of this document, where there's, restrictions to what that could be utilized for.
And if I may add to that, anything that we want to spend this money on would go through the Board of Education. They would vote on that, and once it's approved, it then comes to you folks, so you can see what the spending is going to be for. And then based on your feelings of if we're appropriately spending things, you could then either deny or allow future deposits into that account. So that's how you have the ultimate control of that account. If you don't like what we're doing with the money because we may have gone outside what you feel to be the bounds, you just don't let us put any money in the future years.
Mr. Brennan, may I have you share the story you spoke about the district that 1 year utilized their excess funds? Because that may help in this case of what happens when there's excess funds that aren't utilized and you have that money and you want to spend it.
So I'm going to tell you the famous story of Commodore 64s. And for anyone who might be watching this video that doesn't know what a Commodore 64 was, there was a time in the youth of many of us here where the Commodore 64 was the school computer. And there's a famous story from the early 80s where a school district had a series of surplus funds at the end of the year. They needed to spend the funds or lose them because they couldn't utilize the funds. They couldn't put out an RFP. They didn't have time. It's a 3-month process, so the funds are going to be spent or used. So they bought enough Commodore 64s to fill 3 rooms. And then, hey, of course, we have computers for kids. We need computers for kids. And because those computers had no infrastructure to support them, because they didn't have staff who were trained in them, by the time those computers were re-accessed, the computers were outdated. The intent of the 2% set aside is really to provide the town and the district the opportunity to take money that taxpayers have voted is for educational purposes, and if the district is fiscally responsible and spends money well and spends under budget, the money is allowed to save for educational purposes. However, it can be spent at a time when it's most appropriate to spend it. We would never in Plainfield buy a room full of Commodore 64s at the end of the year that we weren't prepared to use, but that was the intent of the law. And ultimately, this is about a few things, and I know you don't know me, and that's part of this. This is about trust, this is about relationships, this is about you trusting that fiscally we're going to do what's responsible for the students. I actually asked the administrators to come here today because if you look behind me, most of the people sitting behind me are graduates of Plainfield schools. Most of them have been part of this community for a very long time. I'm from Detroit. So, my father worked at Ford, his father worked at Ford. My sister's an engineer. I'm the lone educator in my family. And, for myself, I've understood, working in Putnam, working in Killenly, how important this budget is, what it means to people, what the mill rate means to people, all of that I get. And if this money goes towards education, we're going to use it towards education. We're going to use it for what we say we're using it for. If we say we're using this for a capital improvement plan, that's where we're going. And when we put out an RFP, we're going to get the town of Plainfield the best possible deal that we can get on that RFP so that we can stretch this dollar as far as we can.
See, I don't think, at least this is just my opinion, not speaking for the board, I don't think that there was a issue with trust necessarily, so much as it is being very conscious that the median household income in this town is south of $45,000 a year, and that we have a fairly rigorous budget process every year to authorize compulsory taxation, not voluntary. We don't pass around the hat in that sense. You don't get to choose if you're going to pay taxes this year to support the school budget or not. And the notion that we could have, even in a one-time event, dollars that were taxed from the people of Plainfield that didn't end up going towards what they were supposed to be spent on for any reasons, not assuming malicious intent. Stuff happens. And then that it gets to be repurposed as the board sees fit. Speaking just for myself, seems entirely antithetical to the entire financial process of a smooth running democracy in the town. There needs to be more conversations and more meetings get a better idea of what our expenses are or what the risks are going forward when dealing with a potential budget line if it needs to blow up, then it's our duty as elected or appointed members of these boards to do our very best in presenting that to the public and making that argument. And if it doesn't work, then we come back because you're still not gaining consent of the majority. Whether that is a comfortable acknowledgement or not on the part of many, and sometimes very few who might be dealing with the need for an excess appropriation due to certain circumstances, it's still what the process is. And I'm not sure that we have a great idea to reinvent that process, but I'm also not entirely sold that a 2% set aside that seems to really just be advantageous during this one-off event of COVID, when we have plenty of financial history pointing to us running our Board of Ed budgets fairly tight to what the original mark was. I don't believe that it's ultimately necessary, and I don't foresee whether we would want to make contributions to this account or not going forward. I don't foresee many circumstances where we would be in a position to contribute very much at all, which would almost be defeating the purpose.
Isn't that the point of a representative democracy, though? To elect people you think are fit enough to make those decisions for the public. So if we put the money in the account.
I'm sorry, I can't understand.
Isn't that the point of the representative democracy? Is that we elect people we believe are most fit to make these decisions for us. So if the money is allocated into 2% setback and the Board of Ed wants to use it for X, Y, or Z, fire retardant curtains, to revisit your earlier point, why would they not be the best ones, the most fit ones to make those decisions when the public has already voted them to make those decisions for them?
For that budget year, I would agree 100%. But you have an established budget process that reviews that process annually. And I'll concede the point that is true. That is how representative democracy works in that case. But so long as we're talking about dollars going to this account and not people, that money rightfully belongs with the individual to begin with.
Dollars that they have voted on.
That they believe. And I do feel like the fire retardant curtains, that just seems to me like something that would be part of the budget, putting together as a priority. And if it's not, then maybe that's a hill worth dying on to present to the public that we have these kinds of expenses we need to account for on an annual basis, rather than hoping to backdoor it when the money is being unexpended for whatever
That
reason.
was one thing given. It was discussed previously. It's always in our facility operations plan. But when we are asked to give examples, that is an example. Another example, getting a new updated heating energy efficiency plan so that we could know and study our schools to determine what we need. That's going to be a significant cost. That's something that we could consider taking out of us.
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of comments and some questions. To the Finance Director, you currently have $500,000 in the set-aside that's been previously established, is that correct?
I believe, Mrs. Vashon, is that correct?
It's $674,000.
Okay, $674,000. And you're looking to take unexpended monies from this year and add to it.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the maximum you can put in based on your budget is another $700,000.
Yes, sir.
So you would have close to $1.4 million in that account, if that is approved.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that based on things happening in the Capitol, that MDRs are most likely to be stabbed without being allowed to be changed. Is that correct? Because of the COVID process that's taking place that's impacting everything?
So let me clarify on that. My understanding from the state, based on the last conversation we had with the state, I always have to qualify things, I apologize, but, is that the student enrollment part of MDR is being considered as whole harmless. As far as the other elements, I haven't heard any other parts to any of the other factors.
Okay. The other question I have is, let's say you come to the board and you have a request for, let's say, $50,000 for the retardant curtains. And that's an appropriation from the town budget. that could actually, has the potential, the full 50,000 has the potential to be added to next year's budget, even though it's a one-time expense.
When the town appropriates the money, that becomes part of that year's
That year's
appropriation.
budget. So the following year is not included, and so the actual budget for the school, the Board of Education, could be reduced by that 50,000.
It could not. So the
So
following.
even though it's a one-time purchase, once you reach that level, it stays there.
Correct.
Unless, of course, there's a greater impact on the enrollment, which actually brings the formula down. And enrollment is not going to be factored into the MDR for the next year or so.
We have been told it may not be.
Okay.
So I'm
Which means it's not gonna be.
qualifying that one, but
Yeah.
nothing surprising.
Yeah. Well, the safest bet is that it's not, they're not going to allow that change to be part of the process. If you have, you mentioned one of the things that, about efficiencies that could potentially reduce the MDR. And would that be an underutilized building that could possibly be closed completely? That is being utilized by, for educational purposes, but not fully utilized?
You know, I'd like to speak to, so in all earnesty, I don't know of efficiencies that have been approved. If that's something the Board of Finance, that's statewide. If that's something that the Board of Finance would like me to explore or get further information on what has been approved as an efficiency, but I don't want there to be a belief that multiple districts are applying annually for efficiencies that we're not applying for. This was really made as one option for large municipalities if they were able to find a significant way to reduce the cost of their budget, like closing a building or doing some piece like that. So I don't know if that would qualify, and I hesitate to even speculate. But I'm happy to find out.
I had another question, but I forgot to write it down. Actually, I do have one more question for you, sir.
Yes.
One of the things that you mentioned was that even with the set-aside that you folks have, okay, you still have to come to us. But it doesn't necessarily have to go to referendum or town approval. The preliminary process is that you have to come to us. Okay,
The
please.
Board of Education is the one that is the party that would approve what you want to do. I believe it's a courtesy to the Board of Finance to let you know. It's not, I don't think you vote on that.
Okay.
I think it's just for your knowledge to know what we are planning to use the funds for. If, as a group, you decide, ooh, that's not what you really should be using the funds for, then what you can do under your power is stop us from contributing in future years. And that's how you would end up liquidating that account if you are feeling that we're inappropriate in what we're doing.
Can you give me, I don't mean to dominate, but can you give me an example of something that you've done in the past from your set-aside account?
This is the first year. This is the
This
one
is
that
the
I
first year you've
presented
had, but you've had 500,000 in that account.
only since last year.
Okay, all right, thank you.
But another thing that we could consider is that even though we had adopted it as a 2% policy, that could also be reduced down like 1%.
Yeah.
That's what I understand, like other
You can
school
let-
districts might have considered that, instead of just having 2%, it could be down to 1%.
It should be 1%. It could be, I do know regionally that there's a district that's capped
Yeah.
that has said we will contribute money to this town to this particular number, to 2 million, I believe is the number that they've said, and we will never permit this to be more than 2 million based on what they have.
Mr. Chair, I feel it's a point of information that while an account exists on the town ledger, a policy does not. There are no guidelines as of this moment for such an account. So when speaking to what the process would be, all due respect to Mr. Lucier, the town has not adopted any policy outlining what the proper process and procedure and go-forward direction would be regarding certain events or contingencies. I think that's in part what we're supposed to discuss tonight, was what such a policy.
Right, that's what I wanted first, the back and forth question, obviously between Board and Board of Finance. But yes, once we've concluded that, my plan was to mention how now we do need to decide as far as what the next step would be, which definitely is adopting a policy, which is not going to be done tonight. That's one of the reasons why I asked you at the beginning if you had that draft initially that we had looked over and discussed. The Board of Finance hasn't officially discussed and decided that we wanted to propose a draft tonight to adopt. That may very well happen at next month's meeting, but I do still think there needs to be some time to put together a policy for Board of Finance members to look at it. You know, obviously your feedback is welcome, Board of Ed's feedback is welcome. But that does need to be done either way, whether we are going to discontinue the contribution of funding to it, or if we would just not, or if we would want to keep it in existence. You know, the guidelines, you know, bullet points need to be in there so that if a member of the public hears about this 2%, I know some have, and they want to know, so I don't understand how this works, you know, is this something to vote on or whatever? What I would want to do is I want to direct them, like I do with the fund balance policy, of please get a copy from Town Hall. You know, you can get a copy of this policy, and it outlines to you, this is the process for handling the money in this particular account. But as Matt said, we do not have anything like that now, so we will need to do that.
So, go ahead.
Don.
So right now, you're the ones that take that money out and put it aside, right?
Well, we underrun the budget.
Huh?
We underran the budget, and as a result, in discussions with the finance director of the town,
Yeah.
we put that 600,000
Inside.
into the 2% set aside. Yes. This year, we're anticipating another significant underrun because of the prior year. We didn't use bus services, and there were substitute teachers weren't used as much because kids weren't in school. All the things that built up to the fact that we now have another significant underrun. So,
We could say, don't put it back into the fund. That's up to us.
you could.
In future years.
there is currently an account without a policy that has 640,000 or something in that neighborhood that needs a policy to be adopted to guide the process for those expenditures to happen. One of my, I guess it would be a procedural question, would be that through this past budget process, we received a list of what the school budget would be with a column added on as to what the anticipated spend out of that 2% reserve account would be. And I would want there to be some thorough review that for the monies that currently exist in this account, that we're not coming too close to towing the line of communicating such information in such a manner that it becomes an appropriation. Because if you were to, I feel it's not hard to look at a list of monies you plan on spending, and then having a policy that gives approval for expenditure of such funds, that gets interpreted as a appropriation whenever it happens, regardless of which account it's coming out of. If we're receiving budget statements as we did before, or budget proposals, I should say, that are showing the monies that we would anticipate to be spending from the account, that looks very similar to an appropriation in my book. That's one of the things I would hope that we can iron out for a policy regarding the current account of funds.
If I may add,
Yeah.
there's state statutes that dictate how that's handled. That's why it doesn't impact the MBR, because the state allows us, you, to have this money in 2% set aside for use of educational purposes.
Correct. Given that the Board of Ed is approving the expense or authorizing it per the statute.
Sure.
I guess as an aside, one of the things I guess it would be important to hold the board on would be whether we are in agreement that we see it worthwhile contributing to an account in the future for purposes of the policy document, because I feel like that could impact how this document is written and what is in it.
Yeah, Kelly, one of the things that, you know, again, however we decide we're going to want to develop this policy, is it needs to be clarified in there if we're, you know, as long as it's in existence, and as long as there's money in there, that then they're going to, you know, in this case, be spending on the Infinite Vision's financial software. I think the question that you had was, so what's the next step? Because basically the request comes from the business office,
Yeah,
goes to you, you have to transfer.
yeah, I agree with that. There needs to be some sort of policy, so I know what the
Right.
process is gonna be. So
Right,
when
'cause
I
you have to
release
transfer it,
the
and then
funds,
they're going to write the
it's
check
good to go,
or
you
the
know?
transaction.
Yeah, because I have no policy right now to go by.
Right.
I feel like a lot of the discussion has been about the merits of such an account when we're really much further back in this step than this. The account exists, where it's really about how we want to approach a go-forward on this. I personally, probably not a surprise at this point, I'm not in favor of future contributions to such an account. Having read the state statute countless times, I am not a legal professional, but I would understand this to mean that the Board of Ed can spend this money, authorize it, as long as it is an educational expense, falls under that umbrella. The funds in this account can be expended as such. Having seen some of the other policies that towns have adopted, I think it would be important that there be Board of Finance approval on those funds as well, given that the account is on the town side of the ledger in the first place. So that money would be moving in whatever amount and should have Board of Finance oversight in the interim, as it's not going to be answerable to a public vote or hearing.
But Mr. Riddell, that's per state statute. You know, that's not something that we've developed. The fact that the Board of Finance doesn't have the power to approve that release of money that the Board of Ed has already approved. It's because it's Board of Ed funds that are being used for educational purposes. And I think it's a courtesy that the Board of Finance knows what the money is being used for, so you can make those decisions for future contributions.
Oh, as stated, I'm no legal professional, but if that was to be the correct judgment, I feel that would just bolster my opinion for now wanting to contribute continuously in the future to such an account. I feel like that's cutting out a large part of the public input that is so crucial when it comes to spending or allocating tax dollars. I will agree that could be very well how that statute is intended to be read.
Yeah, and that was going to be something, of course, on the next item where the way it's worded in the agenda is approval to use the 2% set aside. You know, what you're saying, Ron, is that technically it would be a discussion item, but that it would not actually be an action.
My understanding of the law is that.
By the Board of Finance.
If I can speak to that as well.
Yes, sir.
I have in previous locations gone to speak to the Board of Finance as an explanation of decisions that were made at Board of Education meetings regarding spending of items within an agreement on the fund. So I have gone and talked to boards of finance to say at the previous Board of Ed meeting, they've made the decision to spend this money out of the non-lapsing account on this item, which is found in the capital improvement plan, and then we've spoken to what those items are. That's part of the mutual agreement that we see, which I think was in your policy in the first section, identifying some areas where it could be spent, capital improvement, special ed, those pieces. And that discussion is really just one more accountability measure. We talked about the public having accountability measures on the money, that the policy defines how the money can be spent.
Just for clarification on me, if the Board of Education decides to spend that $600,000, there's nothing the Board of Finance can do about that, except just not give them any more money. Am I correct?
That would be accurate.
Well,
I believe the spirit of that law was written in such a way, and I may be overstepping a bound here, so if anybody knows something different, please tell me. The good people of the town approved the prior year appropriation. That money that they paid their taxes for was for educational purposes. It happened to be a situation in these last couple of years where those monies weren't fully needed because of the situation we were in. The law, I believe, is written so that the monies can be put aside for future future education purchases, because it's really already been approved and appropriated by the town, by the townspeople. The money isn't being misused. It's being used for things that are either on our capital plan or have been called out in our operating budget, where, as you saw in our operating budget this year, we had that line that listed all the items that were one-time expenditures that instead of adding to the MBR, were going to be used from the 2% set aside. So it's a win-win for everyone. The school system gets upgraded, townspeople's money is used for education purposes. It's a win-win.